The fastest way to discover who a person really is, Nathaniel Brooks once told his investors with a slow smile, is to give them pressure and an audience. The private dining room overlooking Midtown Manhattan glowed beneath warm amber lights as crystal glasses clinked softly against marble tables worth more than most people's yearly salaries. Rain slid slowly down the floor-to-ceiling windows 32 stories above Park Avenue, while the city pulsed below like a living machine. Nathaniel adjusted the cuff of his charcoal Tom Ford suit and glanced around the room with practiced calm. At 42, he had built Brooks Capital into one of the most aggressive investment firms on the East Coast. Financial magazines called him brilliant. Former employees called him terrifying. Tonight's dinner was supposed to secure a partnership with Al Rashid Global Holdings, a billion-dollar international expansion that had taken 11 months of negotiations to arrange. Every detail mattered. Every word mattered. And Nathaniel enjoyed watching people crack under that kind of pressure. "Your whiskey, sir." The voice arrived softly beside him. Calm. Controlled. Nathaniel looked up distractedly, expecting another nervous server trying too hard to impress wealthy clients. Instead, he found himself staring at a woman who looked strangely untouched by the atmosphere around her. Claire Bennett stood beside the table wearing a simple black restaurant uniform with her blonde hair tied neatly behind her head. No jewelry except a small silver watch. No dramatic makeup. No forced smile. Just clear gray eyes and the kind of stillness that made people either uncomfortable or curious. Nathaniel accepted the glass without thanking her. "You're late," he said casually, checking his Swiss watch. "By about 40 seconds. One of the younger executives laughed quietly. Another lowered his eyes into his wine. Claire did not react. "I apologize for the delay, sir," she said evenly. "The kitchen corrected the temperature on your steak before serving it." Nathaniel leaned back slightly. "Interesting choice. Most people would have blamed someone else." "Most people don't expect precision while accepting excuses," Claire replied. The table went quiet for half a second. Not long. Just enough for someone across the room to stop moving their fork. Nathaniel's mouth almost curved into a smile. "Almost. You sound educated for someone carrying plates." Beside him, Daniel Mercer, one of the senior partners, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The comment had landed harder than expected. But Nathaniel continued sipping his whiskey, watching her carefully over the rim of the crystal glass. Claire placed another plate carefully before one of the Arab executives without rushing her movements. "Education and employment don't always move together, sir." Her tone stayed respectful, but something beneath it felt immovable. Nathaniel noticed. So did everyone else. Outside, thunder rolled quietly above the city. The rain thickened against the glass. "Tell me something," Nathaniel said louder now, leaning forward slightly so the entire table could hear. "You work in one of the most expensive restaurants in Manhattan. You serve people discussing deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars every night. Doesn't that ever bother you?" Claire glanced toward him calmly. "Does what bother me?" "Watching other people control the world while you refill their water." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the table. Someone cleared their throat. Nathaniel enjoyed these moments. The tension, the imbalance, the invisible pressure filling the room like rising heat. Usually people laughed nervously or looked down at the floor. Claire did neither. She simply folded her hands lightly in front of her apron and answered with a quietness that somehow forced everyone else into silence. "No, sir," she said. "Because the people quietly observing the table usually understand it better than the people trying to dominate it." A glass stopped halfway to someone's mouth. Nathaniel's expression did not change immediately, but something flickered behind his eyes. Claire turned smoothly toward another guest and refilled his wine without trembling once. The older executive from Dubai studied her openly now. Nathaniel noticed that too. "Careful," Nathaniel said after a moment, his voice softer now. "Confidence can become arrogance very quickly." Claire nodded once. "That's true." She reached toward the center of the table and adjusted a folded contract packet that had begun sliding dangerously close to a water ring beneath one of the glasses. Small movement, quiet movement, but efficient. And sometimes arrogance simply becomes louder confidence. Daniel coughed into his napkin, trying to hide a laugh. Nathaniel slowly lowered his whiskey onto the table. The sound of crystal touching marble echoed sharper than before. Across the room, even the piano player seemed quieter. Claire stepped back politely. Will there be anything else this evening, Mr. Brooks? Nathaniel looked at her for several long seconds. Most people rushed to fill silence around him because silence around powerful men felt dangerous. Claire allowed it to exist naturally. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Finally, he smiled slightly, though there was no warmth in it yet. Actually, he said calmly, I think there will. The rain continued sliding down the glass walls of the private dining room in long silver streaks, while the skyline beyond Manhattan blurred into soft gold and charcoal light. Nobody at the table reached for their drinks anymore. Nathaniel Brooks leaned back slowly in his chair, studying Claire Bennett with the same cold concentration he usually reserved for acquisition targets and legal negotiations. She had embarrassed him without raising her voice once. That alone made her dangerous. Claire stood beside the service station near the doorway, reviewing another table's order with calm efficiency as though nothing unusual had happened. No triumphant smile. No nervousness. Just composure. Nathaniel tapped one finger lightly against the side of his whiskey glass. Miss Bennett, he said finally. The room shifted again. Several executives exchanged subtle looks. Claire turned toward him immediately. Yes, sir. Come back for a moment. She approached the table without hesitation. The soft clicks of her black shoes against the marble floor seemed strangely loud beneath the low jazz music drifting through hidden speakers overhead. Nathaniel noticed something irritating about her presence. She never hurried toward powerful people. Most employees in places like this practically rushed whenever wealthy clients spoke. Claire moved like someone who believed her dignity arrived before her paycheck. You seem confident discussing business philosophy, Nathaniel said. Tell me something useful. Daniel Mercer shifted in his seat again. Nathaniel, he muttered quietly, but Nathaniel ignored him. Claire folded her hands loosely in front of her apron. Useful in what category? A faint smile touched Nathaniel's mouth. Interesting answer. He reached toward the center of the table where several folders sat stacked beside an expensive fountain pen. We are discussing a logistics expansion into Dubai. $800 million over 5 years. International manufacturing. Shipping infrastructure. Labor projections. Very boring things. Claire nodded politely. I am sure it matters deeply to the people investing in it. One of the Arab executives gave the smallest visible smile. Nathaniel noticed that too. Suppose, Nathaniel continued carefully, someone at this table believed expansion was a mistake. What would your argument be? Daniel let out a slow breath under his nose. Another partner looked down into his wine as if trying to disappear. The challenge was obvious now. Nathaniel was no longer teasing her. He was testing her publicly. Claire glanced briefly toward the rain beyond the windows before answering. I would need more information. Nathaniel leaned forward slightly. No, you would need instincts. Silence settled again. Claire remained still for 2 long seconds. Then she looked directly at him. Expansion is usually not where powerful companies fail. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed with interest despite himself. Go on. They fail because successful people start confusing movement with vision. Nobody touched their silverware anymore. Claire's voice stayed calm and low, yet every person at the table listened harder each time she spoke. A company grows fast, she continued. Everyone celebrates. Investors feel invincible. Executives become addicted to larger numbers. Then eventually somebody asks the wrong question. Nathaniel crossed one leg slowly. And what question is that? Claire looked briefly at the thick contract packet near his hand. Not whether the company can expand. Her gray eyes lifted back toward him. Whether the people leading it still understand why it should. The older executive from Dubai slowly lowered his wine glass onto the tablecloth. No sound followed. Nathaniel felt something uncomfortable move beneath his ribs. Not anger exactly. More like resistance meeting pressure from an unexpected direction. He had spent 20 years becoming the smartest voice in every room he entered. Tonight the balance kept shifting away from him inch by inch. That sounds poetic, Nathaniel said coolly. But poetry does not survive quarterly earnings. Claire nodded once. Neither does arrogance during recessions. Daniel coughed suddenly to hide another laugh. One of the younger associates stared down at his plate in open panic. Nathaniel's expression hardened slightly, though his voice remained smooth. You seem unusually comfortable criticizing people far above your pay grade. Claire did not blink. Respectfully, sir, intelligence does not use salary as identification. The room went completely still. Even the rain against the windows seemed softer now. Nathaniel stared at her for several long seconds. Most people eventually looked away from him. Claire never did. Not defiantly. Not emotionally. Just steadily. Like someone who had already survived harder things than wealthy men with sharp opinions. Finally, Nathaniel stood up from his chair and walked slowly toward the window overlooking Park Avenue. His reflection appeared faintly against the dark storm outside. He loosened one cuff slightly before speaking again. "Do you know why I dislike idealists, Miss Bennet?" Claire remained beside the table. "No, sir. Because idealists usually collapse the moment reality becomes expensive." Claire glanced down briefly as she adjusted a folded linen napkin near one of the untouched plates. Sometimes reality becomes expensive because powerful people stop listening to honest voices while they still have time. Nathaniel turned slowly toward her. Something shifted visibly behind his expression then. Not amusement anymore. Curiosity. Real curiosity. Dangerous curiosity. The kind that changes the direction of an evening before anyone notices it happening. Across the room, lightning flashed faintly behind the skyline. The silver watch around Claire's wrist reflected the light for half a second before disappearing again beneath the soft amber glow of the dining room. Nathaniel noticed the watch immediately, and for the first time that night, he stopped seeing her as part of the background. Nathaniel Brooks kept his eyes on Claire Bennet long after the rest of the table returned to their conversations. The private dining room had regained its noise slowly, cautiously, like people stepping onto thin ice after hearing something crack beneath them. Soft jazz floated through hidden speakers again. Crystal glasses moved. Silverware touched porcelain. But the atmosphere had changed. Everyone felt it. Claire turned away from the table with the same quiet composure she had carried all evening and walked toward another section of the restaurant where a young couple sat beneath a hanging chandelier, sharing dessert. Nathaniel watched the effortless way she shifted between worlds. One moment, she was challenging a billionaire in front of international investors. The next, she was refilling coffee with gentle professionalism like nothing unusual had happened. Daniel Mercer loosened his tie slightly. "You should let this go," he muttered under his breath. Nathaniel did not look at him. "Why?" "Because every person in this room can tell you are no longer enjoying yourself." That finally pulled Nathaniel's attention away from Claire. He turned slowly toward Daniel with a faint smile that carried no warmth. "I am enjoying myself very much." Daniel glanced toward the rain-streaked windows. "No, you are trying to win now. That is different." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair again, fingertips resting lightly against the edge of the tablecloth. Across from him, Hassan al-Rashid quietly closed one of the contract folders and folded his hands together. The older businessman had spoken little throughout the evening, preferring observation over interruption. Nathaniel respected that about him. Powerful men who stayed quiet were usually the most dangerous. Hassan finally spoke in a calm, accented voice. "Your waitress is unusual." Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost invisibly at the phrase "your waitress." He disliked how quickly the room had begun associating Claire with him somehow. "She is articulate," Nathaniel answered carefully. Hassan gave a slow nod. "No. Articulate people usually want attention." His eyes drifted briefly toward Claire across the room. "That woman wants distance." Nathaniel said nothing. Because Hassan was right. Claire never tried to impress anyone. She spoke the way certain people carried expensive watches. Quietly. Without explanation. A younger executive sitting near the end of the table laughed nervously. "Honestly, she sounds like half the people at Harvard Business School." "No," Hassan replied calmly. "She sounds like someone who stopped trusting rooms like this a long time ago." Silence followed again. Nathaniel reached for his whiskey but stopped halfway. Across the room, Claire had paused beside the young couple's table while adjusting the candle between them after the flame flickered too low. Small movement. Careful movement. The woman thanked her softly. Claire smiled politely, but the smile disappeared almost immediately afterward, like something she used professionally rather than emotionally. Nathaniel noticed that too. He disliked how much he had started noticing. "Sir." Another server approached carefully beside him. "Your next course is ready." Nathaniel gave a distracted nod. Plates began arriving moments later beneath silver covers, releasing thin streams of heat into the cool amber lighting. Filet mignon, truffle potatoes, roasted vegetables arranged with artistic precision. Expensive food prepared for expensive conversations. Yet somehow none of it mattered anymore, because every person at the table kept glancing toward the woman moving silently through the dining room. Nathaniel cut into his steak mechanically before finally speaking again. "Bring Miss Bennet back." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Nathaniel." "Now." The younger server hesitated before hurrying away. Less than a minute later, Claire returned, calm as ever. "Yes, Mr. Brooks?" Nathaniel gestured lightly toward the empty chair near the end of the table. "Sit for a moment." Several executives looked visibly uncomfortable now. Claire remained standing. "I do not think your guests came here to watch you interrogate restaurant staff." One of the younger associates nearly choked on his wine, trying not to react. Nathaniel felt something unfamiliar press against his patience. Not irritation exactly. Resistance. Claire never gave him the emotional reaction he expected from people. She simply redirected pressure back toward him without raising her voice. "Humor me," Nathaniel said. Claire studied him for 2 long seconds before finally sitting carefully at the far end of the table. Straight posture. Calm eyes. Hands folded lightly together. Nathaniel noticed the silver watch on her wrist again beneath the candlelight. Thin case. Worn leather band. Elegant, but understated. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Where did you get that watch?" Claire glanced down briefly. "My father gave it to me." "Vintage Jaeger LeCoultre," Nathaniel said automatically. 1996 collection. Rare model. Claire looked mildly surprised for the first time all evening. Most people do not recognize it. Nathaniel rested his knife beside his plate. Most people do not spend 20 years around collectors. Claire gave a small nod. "Then you probably know the original craftsman who designed this dial passed away in Geneva 2 months before production ended." The entire table went silent again. Nathaniel stared at her. That information was obscure even among serious collectors. Daniel slowly lowered his fork. Hassan al-Rashid leaned back in his chair with visible interest now. Claire seemed to realize what she had revealed and calmly reached for her water glass instead. Nathaniel watched her over the candlelight. Watched the steady hand, the controlled breathing, the complete absence of performance. Finally, he spoke quietly. "Who exactly are you, Claire Bennet?" She looked directly at him, and for the first time that night, something almost sad moved behind her calm gray eyes. "Someone who learned very early," she said softly, "that people only respect intelligence when it arrives wearing expensive clothes." The words settled over the table like smoke that nobody knew how to clear away. Someone quietly placed their fork down against porcelain. Another executive shifted in his chair and looked toward the windows as though the storm outside had suddenly become more interesting than the conversation inside. Nathaniel Brooks remained perfectly still. Claire Bennet sat calmly at the far end of the table beneath the soft amber glow of the chandelier, one hand resting lightly beside her water glass, her silver watch reflecting faint streaks of candlelight across the white tablecloth. She had not raised her voice once all evening, yet somehow she controlled the emotional temperature of the entire room. Nathaniel noticed that realization spreading slowly across the faces around him, and he hated how much he respected it. Hassan al-Rashid leaned back thoughtfully, studying Claire with quiet fascination. "That is a very expensive lesson to learn young," he said softly. Claire gave a small nod. "Most meaningful lessons are." Nathaniel watched her carefully. There was no bitterness in her voice. That was what unsettled him most. Bitterness he understood. He had built entire industries around people driven by resentment and ambition. But Claire spoke like someone who had already survived disappointment long ago and no longer needed the world to apologize for it. Daniel Mercer finally broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Well," he muttered, "this is officially the strangest business dinner I have attended in 15 years. A few people smiled weakly. The tension loosened slightly. But Nathaniel kept his eyes on Claire. "You still have not answered my question," he said quietly. Claire met his gaze evenly. "Which question?" "Who are you really?" The rain pressed harder against the glass walls overlooking Park Avenue. Far below, yellow taxi lights moved through Manhattan like rivers of gold beneath the storm. Claire glanced briefly toward the city before looking back at Nathaniel. "I think people become dangerous when they spend too much time believing titles explain character." Nathaniel rested one arm along the back of his chair. "That sounds like avoidance. That sounds like experience." Hassan smiled faintly into his wine glass. Nathaniel noticed. Again, he had spent years mastering conversations inside rooms exactly like this one. Usually people competed for his approval, his investments, his attention. Claire seemed entirely uninterested in all three, and that made her impossible to predict. One of the younger associates sitting near the end of the table suddenly cleared his throat. "Actually," he said carefully, "I think I know who she is." Every head turned toward him. The young man immediately looked uncomfortable beneath the sudden attention. Claire's expression remained unreadable, but Nathaniel noticed the slightest tightening in her posture. Very small, almost invisible. "Ethan," Nathaniel said calmly. "Continue." Ethan swallowed once. 3 years ago, I interned briefly at Blackmere Capital before coming to Brooks Capital." Claire lowered her eyes toward the table for the first time all evening. There was a senior analyst there named Claire Bennett. Silence returned instantly. Ethan looked between them uncertainly. People used to talk about her constantly. They said she predicted a market correction almost 8 months before everyone else saw it coming. Nathaniel's expression changed slowly. "Blackmere?" Ethan nodded carefully. "She left after some kind of scandal involving leaked client data." Daniel frowned immediately. "I remember that situation." Hassan's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Nathaniel looked back toward Claire. "You worked at Blackmere Capital?" Claire remained quiet for 2 long seconds before answering softly. "Yes." "And you never thought to mention that while serving dinner?" Nathaniel asked. Claire finally looked directly at him again. "Would it have changed the way you spoke to me earlier?" The question landed harder than Nathaniel expected. He opened his mouth slightly, then stopped, because the answer was obvious. Yes, of course it would have. The room felt strangely smaller suddenly. The city lights beyond the glass seemed farther away now, blurred beneath sheets of rain and reflection. Ethan continued awkwardly. "People said she was one of the best analysts in the company." Claire's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "People say many things after someone disappears." Nathaniel leaned forward slowly. "Why did you leave?" Claire's fingers rested quietly against the side of her water glass. "My father became sick." Her voice remained calm, but softer now. "Alzheimer's." Nobody spoke. "The scandal happened the same month his condition worsened," she continued. "Blackmere needed someone to blame publicly, and I needed health insurance more than I needed pride." Daniel stared at her in stunned silence. Hassan lowered his eyes briefly in quiet understanding. Nathaniel felt something unfamiliar settle heavily beneath his chest. Not pity. Claire would probably hate pity. It was something sharper, something uncomfortably close to shame, because suddenly the entire evening rearranged itself inside his head. The calmness, the distance, the refusal to perform. Claire Bennett was not intimidated by wealthy men because she had once lived inside their world already. She understood exactly how fragile powerful people became whenever status disappeared from a conversation. Across the room, the piano player shifted into a slower melody. Soft notes floated through the restaurant while candlelight flickered gently against crystal and silver. Claire stood carefully from the chair. "If there is nothing else, gentlemen, other guests are waiting." Nathaniel looked up at her. For the first time that evening, he noticed exhaustion beneath her composure. Not physical exhaustion, something deeper. The exhaustion of someone constantly forced to prove they deserved respect after losing the right clothes, the right office, the right title. He watched her straighten the sleeve of her black uniform quietly beneath the warm light. Then his eyes drifted once more toward the silver watch on her wrist. A gift from her father, a memory she carried instead of displaying. Nathaniel suddenly understood why she never tried to impress anyone in the room. People who had already lost everything important usually stopped caring about shallow victories. Claire Bennett moved away from the private table with quiet professionalism, carrying an empty wine bottle against her side, while the soft glow of Manhattan reflected across the polished marble floors beneath her feet. Yet, even after she disappeared toward the main dining room, the silence she left behind remained sitting with the men at the table like an uninvited guest nobody knew how to dismiss. Nathaniel Brooks stared down at the untouched steak cooling slowly on his plate. Across from him, Hassan al-Rashid folded his napkin carefully beside his glass and spoke without lifting his eyes. "You embarrassed her." Nathaniel's jaw tightened faintly. "She handled herself very well." Hassan finally looked up. "That is not the same thing." Daniel Mercer leaned back heavily in his chair and exhaled through his nose. "Honestly, Nathaniel, I have known you for 12 years. He reached for his bourbon. and I do not think I have ever seen someone make you lose control so politely. Nathaniel gave a cold smile. You are exaggerating. No, Daniel replied calmly. You stopped treating her like staff 30 minutes ago. Now you are trying to figure out why. Nathaniel said nothing. Because the answer irritated him precisely because it was true. Claire Bennett had entered the evening as background noise. Another uniform. Another employee inside another expensive room filled with wealthy people pretending they controlled the world. But somewhere between the first challenge and the last answer, the balance had shifted. Nathaniel disliked shifts he did not predict. Hassan reached slowly for the contract packet near the center of the table. Your waitress was correct earlier. Nathaniel looked toward him immediately. About what? Expansion. Hassan opened the folder calmly and adjusted his reading glasses. Too many executives mistake ambition for direction. He turned several pages slowly beneath the candlelight. And too many investors become intoxicated by scale before they study stability. Nathaniel leaned back again, expression unreadable now. Daniel frowned slightly. You are reconsidering the Dubai logistics proposal? Hassan tapped one page lightly with his finger. I am reconsidering the projections. The atmosphere changed instantly. Nathaniel straightened subtly in his chair. What projections? Hassan slid the folder across the table without drama. Page 42. Daniel leaned over first. Nathaniel followed seconds later. A series of shipping forecasts and infrastructure costs filled the page beneath detailed graphs and international conversion tables. Numbers. Percentages. Risk margins. Normally, Nathaniel could process financial documents faster than almost anyone in the room. Tonight, his focus felt strangely fragmented. I reviewed this twice already, Daniel muttered. Hassan remained calm. Then perhaps review the decimal placement under projected labor expansion. Nathaniel's eyes moved instantly toward the line item, then stopped. A small silence opened inside his chest. 1 decimal point. Tiny. Nearly invisible beneath dense financial formatting. But catastrophic. Daniel's face lost color immediately. That cannot be right. Nathaniel grabbed the packet fully now, flipping pages faster beneath the warm dining room light. Shipping projections. Insurance calculations. International payroll estimates. The decimal error distorted nearly $18 million across the 5-year forecast model. Enough to destabilize investor confidence instantly if exposed publicly tomorrow morning during final presentations. Daniel swore quietly beneath his breath. Who reviewed this? Nathaniel's voice turned dangerously calm. 3 separate analysts. Hassan folded his hands together. Then all 3 analysts were tired. The room tightened around them. Outside, thunder rolled low above the city while rain hammered harder against the glass walls overlooking Park Avenue. Nathaniel stared at the numbers again, pulse slowing into the cold, focused rhythm that usually appeared during financial emergencies. But underneath that focus came another realization. Claire had sensed instability in the deal almost immediately tonight. Not because she had seen the documents. Because she understood the psychology behind them. Hassan closed the folder gently. Interesting timing. Nathaniel looked up sharply. What do you mean? Hassan's expression remained unreadable. A woman spends an hour warning powerful men that ambition without clarity becomes dangerous. He nodded lightly toward the contracts. Then the room discovers $18 million hiding behind a single misplaced decimal. Nobody answered him. Because nobody could. Nathaniel slowly leaned back in his chair again, staring through the rain-covered windows toward the blurred gold lights of Manhattan. Somewhere beyond the private dining room, Claire Bennett continued carrying plates and refilling glasses while the men around this table quietly unraveled a mistake large enough to destroy months of negotiations. The imbalance of that reality unsettled him deeply. Daniel rubbed one hand over his face. We can still fix this before tomorrow morning. Nathaniel remained silent another few seconds before speaking quietly. No, Daniel looked confused. No. Nathaniel's eyes drifted toward the doorway where Claire had disappeared earlier. We fix it tonight. Hassan's mouth curved into the faintest visible smile. Daniel frowned slowly as realization spread across his expression. You cannot seriously be considering asking her for help. Nathaniel stood slowly from his chair and adjusted the front of his suit jacket beneath the amber light. His reflection moved faintly against the storm-dark windows behind him. I am considering, he said calmly, that the smartest person in this room tonight was carrying dinner plates while the rest of us congratulated ourselves. Silence followed him as he stepped away from the table. Across the restaurant, Claire Bennett stood near the bar quietly reviewing another receipt beneath the soft chandelier glow. She looked peaceful from a distance, untouchable somehow. Nathaniel watched her for several seconds before finally walking toward her through the warm gold light and low piano music, feeling something unfamiliar settle beneath his chest for the first time in years. Humility. Nathaniel Brooks crossed the dining room slowly while the soft piano melody drifted beneath the low conversations of Manhattan's elite. Candlelight reflected against polished glass and silver as servers moved carefully between tables carrying expensive wine and perfectly arranged plates. Yet for Nathaniel, the entire restaurant had narrowed into a single point of focus near the marble bar at the far end of the room. Claire Bennett stood beneath a hanging chandelier reviewing receipts beside the register terminal, her expression calm beneath the warm amber glow. She looked completely untouched by the chaos she had quietly created tonight. Nathaniel stopped several feet away from her before speaking. "Miss Bennett." Claire looked up immediately. "Mr. Brooks." Her tone remained professional, controlled, as though the evening had not shifted both their worlds inch by inch over the last 2 hours. Nathaniel noticed the exhaustion behind her eyes again now that he stood closer. Not weakness, fatigue. The kind carried by people who spent years holding themselves together without expecting help from anyone. "I need your opinion," Nathaniel said quietly. Claire blinked once, surprised by the wording more than the request itself. "That is a dangerous sentence from someone like you." Nathaniel almost smiled. "Probably." Rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows surrounding the restaurant, while distant thunder rolled somewhere above Midtown. Claire placed the receipts neatly beside the register before folding her hands lightly in front of her apron. "What exactly do you need?" Nathaniel hesitated. That alone felt unfamiliar. Men like him were trained to dominate rooms through certainty. Hesitation looked expensive in his world, but something about Claire made performance feel useless. "There is a financial discrepancy in tomorrow's expansion proposal," he admitted. $18 million hidden behind an incorrect decimal placement. Claire's expression did not change dramatically. That somehow made the situation feel even more serious. "And you are only discovering this tonight?" Nathaniel gave a quiet exhale through his nose. "Apparently." Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the marble counter, thinking, who prepared the projections? 3 analysts. Then all 3 were likely exhausted. Nathaniel stared at her for half a second before giving the smallest visible smile. "Hassan said the exact same thing." Claire nodded faintly. "Smart people become dangerous when they stop sleeping." Nathaniel leaned one hand lightly against the edge of the bar. "The problem is larger than the calculation itself. Hassan is reconsidering the entire proposal now." Claire glanced toward the private dining room across the restaurant where several executives remained seated beneath the golden lights. "Because the mistake revealed carelessness." Nathaniel looked at her carefully. "You really do understand this world." Claire reached for a clean wine glass beside the counter and polished an invisible fingerprint from the surface with a folded cloth. "Small movement. Quiet movement." "I understand pressure," she answered softly. "There is a difference." Nathaniel watched her reflection move faintly across the polished glass. "Would you look at the numbers?" Claire paused. The cloth stopped moving briefly between her fingers. "You are asking a waitress to review an international investment proposal?" "I am asking the smartest person in the room." Claire finally looked up at him again. Something unreadable flickered behind her calm gray eyes. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something sadder than both. "You did not think that 3 hours ago." Nathaniel felt the words land cleanly against his chest because they were true. Earlier tonight, he had treated her like entertainment, a clever distraction between courses. Now he stood beside a marble bar asking for help with a financial disaster that could cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Funny how quickly arrogance collapses once reality arrives carrying consequences. Claire set the wine glass down carefully. "Why does your company want the Dubai expansion so badly?" Nathaniel frowned slightly at the unexpected question. "Because international infrastructure is the future." Claire shook her head once. "That is the presentation answer." Silence stretched briefly between them. Nathaniel loosened his tie slightly beneath the warm restaurant lighting. "Because if Brooks Capital does not expand internationally this year, competitors will." Claire studied him quietly. And you are afraid of appearing stagnant. Nathaniel looked away toward the rain-covered windows overlooking Park Avenue. In my industry, perception becomes truth very quickly. Claire nodded slowly. Yes. Her voice softened almost imperceptibly. That is true in most industries. Nearby, a bartender polished crystal glasses beneath soft hanging lights while jazz drifted quietly through hidden speakers overhead. The rest of the restaurant continued moving around them, unaware that a billionaire stood beside a waitress discussing fear disguised as ambition. Claire reached for the contract folder Nathaniel still carried beneath his arm. Let me see it. Nathaniel handed it over immediately. Claire opened the documents without drama, scanning several pages beneath the chandelier light with remarkable speed. Her eyes moved steadily across the projections, calculations, labor estimates, shipping costs. Calm, focused. Nathaniel watched the shift happen almost instantly. The restaurant disappeared from her attention. The noise disappeared. The role disappeared. She no longer looked like a waitress reviewing paperwork after a long shift. She looked like someone returning briefly to a language she once spoke fluently before life interrupted the conversation. Several minutes passed in silence except for distant piano notes and rain against glass. Then Claire stopped at one particular page and frowned faintly. Nathaniel noticed immediately. What is it? Claire's finger rested lightly against a section near the bottom of the labor forecast. The decimal error is not the real problem. Nathaniel straightened slowly. What do you mean? Claire looked up at him calmly. Your company is calculating expansion costs based on ideal labor retention. She tapped the page once. But the turnover projections are unrealistic for international shipping infrastructure. Nathaniel's expression hardened slightly. How unrealistic? Claire closed the folder gently. Realistically? Her gray eyes lifted toward his beneath the warm chandelier glow. If you present this tomorrow morning exactly as written, Hassan al-Rashid will walk away from the deal before lunch. Nathaniel Brooks stared at Claire Bennett across the marble bar while the distant glow of Manhattan shimmered through rain-covered windows behind them. The restaurant noise continued around them in soft waves of laughter, clinking glasses, and low conversations, but everything near Nathaniel suddenly felt quieter, slower. Claire still held the contract folder lightly in her hands beneath the chandelier light, her expression calm despite the weight of what she had just said. If you present this tomorrow morning exactly as written, Hassan al-Rashid will walk away from the deal before lunch. Nathaniel felt the words settle heavily inside his chest because he knew she was probably right. And that realization disturbed him more than the financial mistake itself. Show me, he said quietly. Claire opened the folder again without drama. Her fingers moved carefully across the pages while Nathaniel stepped closer beside her. He could smell faint traces of coffee and clean linen beneath the expensive cologne and polished wood surrounding them. Not perfume, nothing artificial, just simplicity. Claire pointed toward a series of labor retention estimates buried deep within the international shipping projections. Your analysts assumed a retention rate of 82% during the first 24 months. Nathaniel frowned slightly. That is standard for domestic expansion. Claire nodded once. Domestic. Her finger tapped the paper lightly. But Dubai logistics infrastructure runs differently. Workers cycle faster because housing incentives expire. Contractors move constantly between ports. Your turnover rate will likely hit 40% by year 2. Nathaniel's expression sharpened. That high? Possibly higher. Claire turned another page. And because your labor retention assumptions are inflated, your operational stability projections become inflated too. Nathaniel stared down at the numbers. Suddenly, the entire structure beneath the proposal looked weaker than it had an hour earlier. Not collapsing, but fragile. Carefully polished weakness disguised beneath confidence and presentation graphics. Claire continued calmly. Hassan al-Rashid noticed the decimal mistake because he was already testing the logic underneath your expansion model. Nathaniel slowly looked toward the private dining room, where Hassan remained seated beside Daniel Mercer beneath the warm amber lights. The older businessman appeared relaxed from a distance, quietly sipping wine while rain streaked the skyline behind him. But Nathaniel understood men like Hassan. Calm investors became dangerous the moment they sensed carelessness. Can it be fixed? Nathaniel asked. Claire closed the folder softly. Tonight. She considered briefly. Yes. Nathaniel exhaled slowly for what felt like the first time in several minutes. How? Claire handed the folder back to him. Stop trying to impress him. Nathaniel blinked once. Excuse me. Your proposal is trying too hard to look perfect. Claire rested one hand lightly against the marble counter beside her. Investors like Hassan trust transparency more than performance. Nathaniel studied her carefully. You are suggesting I walk into tomorrow's presentation admitting the model is flawed. I am suggesting you walk in showing him you are intelligent enough to catch the flaw before it costs both of you money. The rain hammered harder against the windows. Somewhere near the entrance, thunder rolled low across the city while a waiter carried champagne through the crowded dining room beneath soft golden light. Nathaniel remained silent several seconds. Because Claire was right again, and each time she was right, something inside him became harder to defend. You really did belong at Blackmere, he said quietly. Claire gave a faint smile that disappeared almost immediately. For a while, Nathaniel looked down toward the silver watch on her wrist again. They made a mistake losing you. Claire's eyes lowered briefly toward the marble floor. Companies rarely lose people all at once. Her voice softened slightly. Usually they lose them slowly, one disappointment at a time. Nathaniel felt that sentence more than he expected to, because suddenly he saw the outline of her life in fragments. Long nights, hospital bills, reputation destroyed during the exact moment she needed stability most. And through all of it, she had somehow protected her composure better than most executives protected their careers. Nearby, a server approached nervously beside them. Claire, table 12 needs the check. Claire nodded immediately. I will be there in 1 minute. The young server hurried away. Nathaniel looked at her carefully. You are still working. Claire raised one eyebrow slightly. People still need dinner, Mr. Brooks. Something about the answer almost made him laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was grounding. While wealthy executives panicked over contracts and percentages, Claire Bennett still moved through the evening carrying trays and balancing receipts because life did not pause for pride. Nathaniel glanced back toward the private dining room again. Come with me. Claire frowned slightly. Where? To the table. Nathaniel. It was the first time she had used his first name. Softly, instinctively. Both of them noticed it immediately. Claire's expression tightened almost invisibly before she corrected herself. Mr. Brooks, I am not one of your analysts anymore. Nathaniel looked directly at her. No, his voice lowered slightly beneath the piano music drifting through the restaurant. You are the reason this deal still has a chance. Claire held his gaze quietly. The chandelier light reflected softly in her gray eyes while rain blurred the city behind them into silver and gold. Then, after several long seconds, she reached for a nearby notepad beside the register and tore off a blank sheet of paper. Nathaniel watched as she wrote several quick figures and labor adjustment percentages with steady, controlled movements. No hesitation, no theatrics, just precision. When she finished, she handed the paper to him calmly. Lead with transparency tomorrow morning, she said softly. Not ego. Nathaniel looked down at the handwritten calculations. Clean, sharp, immediate. She had simplified 30 pages of instability into 6 lines of clarity. He slowly folded the paper and placed it carefully inside his jacket pocket like something valuable. Because somehow it was. Across the restaurant, Daniel Mercer watched the interaction from the private table with growing disbelief. Hassan al-Rashid simply smiled faintly into his wine glass as though he had already understood something the rest of them were still learning. Some people entered a room demanding power. Others carried it quietly enough that nobody noticed until the entire room began listening. The private dining room felt different when Nathaniel Brooks walked back inside, carrying the folded sheet of paper Claire Bennett had written for him minutes earlier. The atmosphere had shifted away from polished confidence into something quieter now, more honest. Rain continued running down the tall glass windows surrounding the restaurant, while the Manhattan skyline shimmered beneath storm clouds and distant lightning. Daniel Mercer looked up immediately as Nathaniel returned to the table. Well, Nathaniel remained standing beside his chair instead of sitting. His expression had changed. The sharp arrogance that usually controlled rooms around him had softened into something calmer tonight. Focused. We are restructuring the presentation, he said evenly. Daniel blinked. Tonight? Yes. Hassan al-Rashid slowly placed his wine glass onto the tablecloth and studied Nathaniel carefully. Interesting. Nathaniel unfolded the paper Claire had given him and slid it across the table toward Hassan without unnecessary explanation. The older businessman adjusted his glasses slightly and began reading the handwritten calculations beneath the warm chandelier light. Silence settled again. Daniel leaned closer, confusion slowly spreading across his face as he scanned the notes. "These labor retention adjustments are actually smarter than our original projections," he muttered. Nathaniel nodded once. "Because they are realistic." Hassan remained quiet another few seconds before finally lifting his eyes from the page. "She wrote this in under 2 minutes?" "Yes." Hassan smiled faintly. "Then your waitress is more valuable than half the consultants I have hired this decade." Nathaniel almost corrected the phrase "your waitress" again, but stopped himself, because something about that label no longer felt accurate anyway. Claire Bennett was not simply serving tables tonight. She was quietly stabilizing an international business negotiation while standing beneath restaurant chandeliers, wearing a black uniform and carrying receipt books. The absurdity of that reality humbled him more each minute. Daniel rubbed one hand across his forehead slowly. "I still cannot believe Blackmere let someone like her disappear." Hassan closed the paper carefully and handed it back to Nathaniel. "Companies often destroy the people they should protect most." Nathaniel slipped the folded sheet carefully into his jacket pocket again. Something about preserving her handwriting felt important now. Across the dining room, Claire moved between tables carrying a tray of champagne flutes with the same calm posture she had carried all evening. No one watching her from a distance would ever guess she had just corrected flaws inside a billion-dollar expansion proposal. Nathaniel noticed how naturally she disappeared back into ordinary work after extraordinary moments. No performance, no demand for recognition, just quiet competence. Hassan followed Nathaniel's gaze toward her and spoke softly. "You challenged her publicly earlier tonight." Nathaniel's jaw tightened faintly. "Yes." "Why?" Nathaniel looked down briefly at the untouched whiskey beside his plate. "Because I thought pressure revealed weakness." Hassan gave a slow nod. "And what did it reveal instead?" Nathaniel watched Claire carefully across the restaurant before answering. "Character." The older businessman smiled gently into his wine glass. "Good answer." Daniel leaned back heavily in his chair and exhaled through his nose. "You know what the worst part is?" Nathaniel glanced toward him. Daniel gestured vaguely toward the dining room. "She never once tried to embarrass you back." Silence followed again because Daniel was right. Claire could have humiliated Nathaniel hours ago if she wanted to. She had every opportunity, every advantage emotionally once the room shifted toward her side. But she never weaponized intelligence for cruelty. She simply answered honestly each time he tested her. Nathaniel realized that difference mattered more than he expected. Nearby, another server quietly approached the table carrying fresh coffee. Nathaniel looked up instinctively, half expecting Claire again. But it was a young waiter barely out of college with nervous hands and tired eyes. Nathaniel noticed the young man trembling slightly while pouring coffee beside Hassan's glass. Earlier tonight, Nathaniel probably would have ignored him completely. Now he found himself speaking differently. "Careful," he said quietly. "The cup is too full." The young waiter blinked in surprise before quickly adjusting the pot. "Thank you, sir." Nathaniel gave a small nod. Daniel stared at him openly afterward. "Who are you?" he muttered. "And what have you done with Nathaniel Brooks?" Hassan laughed softly beneath his breath. It was the first genuine laugh Nathaniel had heard from him all evening. Across the room, Claire glanced briefly toward the private dining table while organizing receipts near the register again. For half a second her eyes met Nathaniel's through the warm restaurant light. No smile, no dramatic expression, just recognition, quiet understanding. Then she looked away and returned to work. Somehow that affected Nathaniel more than any admiration would have. Around 10 minutes later, the restaurant manager hurried nervously into the private dining room, carrying a leather-check folder against his chest. "Mr. Brooks," he said carefully, "I sincerely apologize if there were any issues with your service this evening. Claire mentioned there may have been some tension earlier, and I would be happy to—" "No," Nathaniel interrupted gently, but firmly. The manager stopped immediately. Nathaniel reached for his pen and signed the receipt without even glancing at the total. "Your employee conducted herself with more professionalism than most executives I know." The manager blinked in visible surprise. Nathaniel closed the folder and handed it back calmly. "Take care of her." Silence followed those 3 words. The The manager nodded quickly before leaving. Daniel stared at Nathaniel again once the man disappeared. You really mean that? Nathaniel looked toward Claire one final time across the rain-lit restaurant. Yes, he said quietly. I do. Outside the windows, thunder rolled low above Manhattan, while rivers of yellow taxi lights moved through the storm beneath the towering skyline. Inside the warm glow of the restaurant, a woman wearing a simple black uniform quietly continued clearing tables, unaware that somewhere between the first challenge and the final calculation, she had changed the entire emotional gravity of the room without ever once raising her voice. By the time the dinner finally ended, the storm above Manhattan had softened into a steady silver rain that painted the city in blurred reflections and scattered gold light. One by one, the executives from Brooks Capital gathered their coats and briefcases beneath the warm chandelier glow, while quiet conversations drifted through the restaurant like fading echoes. Hassan al-Rashid shook Nathaniel Brooks's hand firmly near the entrance. Tomorrow morning, the older businessman said calmly. We begin again with honesty this time. Nathaniel gave a slow nod. Agreed. Hassan glanced briefly across the dining room, where Claire Bennett stood folding linen napkins near the service station. Do not forget who helped you arrive there. Then he stepped into the elevator with his associates, disappearing behind polished brass doors and soft piano music. Daniel Mercer lingered behind, adjusting his coat while watching Nathaniel carefully. You know, he said quietly, 10 hours ago you would have fired someone for speaking to you the way she did tonight. Nathaniel looked toward the rain-streaked windows overlooking Park Avenue. 10 hours ago, he answered softly. I probably deserved it more. Daniel laughed once beneath his breath, though there was no mockery in it now. Only surprise. Well, he muttered while heading toward the elevators. That woman accomplished what 20 years of corporate therapy could not. Nathaniel remained alone beside the private dining room after everyone else disappeared. The restaurant had grown quieter now. Half the candles had already been extinguished. Staff moved slowly through the remaining tables, collecting wine glasses and folded receipts, while jazz music drifted softly through the nearly empty space. Across the room, Claire continued working beneath the warm amber lighting exactly as she had all evening. Calm, precise, invisible to most people. Nathaniel watched her quietly for several moments before finally walking toward her one last time. Claire noticed him approaching almost immediately. Your guest left? She asked softly. Yes. She nodded once and returned to stacking clean menus near the host's stand. Nathaniel stopped beside her, suddenly aware of how unusual this moment felt. He negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without hesitation. He confronted investors, politicians, hostile boards. Yet standing beside this woman in the quiet aftermath of a storm somehow felt more difficult than any boardroom conversation he had faced in years. Claire placed the final menu neatly into place before looking up at him. Did the deal survive? Nathaniel slipped one hand into his coat pocket, where her folded calculations still rested safely inside. Because of you, probably. Claire's expression remained composed, though he noticed the faintest shadow of relief pass briefly through her eyes. Good. Nathaniel studied her quietly beneath the soft chandelier light. That is all you have to say? Claire gave the smallest visible smile. You are welcome seemed unnecessary. For the first time all evening, Nathaniel laughed genuinely. Not the polished, controlled laugh executives used during negotiations. A real one. Short, quiet, honest. Claire looked slightly surprised by the sound. You should do that more often, she said calmly. People might stop fearing you long enough to tell you the truth. Nathaniel shook his head lightly. You really do not care who you are talking to. Claire looked toward the rain outside the windows. I used to. Her voice softened slightly. Then life got expensive. Silence settled gently between them. But unlike earlier in the evening, it no longer felt sharp or competitive. Just quiet. Human. Somewhere near the kitchen, dishes clinked softly while another server laughed tiredly after a long shift. The city beyond the glass continued glowing beneath rain and headlights. Nathaniel glanced toward Claire's silver watch once more. How is your father? Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the watch on her wrist. Some days he remembers my name. A faint pause. Some days he thinks I am my mother. Nathaniel felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. Claire spoke about heartbreak with the same calmness she used discussing labor projections and investment strategy. No performance. No self-pity. Just truth. I am sorry, he said quietly. Claire nodded once. Thank you. Nathaniel hesitated before speaking again. You could come back, you know. Claire looked at him carefully. Back where? Finance. Nathaniel's voice remained steady now. Someone with your mind should not have to disappear because life became unfair. Claire held his gaze for several long seconds while rain traced silver lines down the dark windows behind them. Then she smiled softly. Not triumphant. Not flirtatious. Just tired and genuine. Nathaniel, she said quietly, there is nothing wrong with honest work. The sentence landed harder than anything else she had said all night. Because Nathaniel suddenly realized she was not ashamed of serving tables. He was the one who had assumed she should be. Claire reached for her coat hanging beside the service station and slipped it over her uniform carefully. The problem, she continued softly, is that people only respect dignity when it arrives wearing a suit. Nathaniel looked down briefly at his own expensive jacket. Italian wool. Perfect tailoring. A uniform no different from hers in the end. Just more expensive. Claire adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder. Good luck tomorrow. Nathaniel looked at her quietly. Will I see you again? Claire considered the question for a moment before answering. That depends. On what? She glanced toward the nearly empty restaurant around them. Toward the rain outside. Toward the skyline glowing through the storm beyond Manhattan. Then back at him. On whether you remember tonight after everyone starts applauding you again. Nathaniel stood silent as Claire Bennett walked slowly toward the restaurant exit beneath the fading amber lights. She did not look back. She did not ask for anything. And somehow that made her unforgettable. A moment later, the front doors opened softly, letting cold rain-scented air drift briefly through the warm restaurant before closing behind her again. Nathaniel remained standing alone beside the dark windows overlooking Park Avenue long after she disappeared into the storm outside. For years he had believed power came from controlling rooms, controlling conversations, controlling people. But tonight a quiet woman wearing a simple black uniform had walked into his world carrying nothing except intelligence, dignity, and calm honesty. And somehow she had left the entire room smaller than she did.